The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So I want to go through sort of three different reactions to this mass shooting that we had in Las Vegas about a day and a half ago. One is from a lunatic Christian pastor. The other is from a country music artist. And then third, we're going to look at the National Rifle Association. Okay. So the NRA apparently realizes that their pro-gun apologia might come off as, I guess, offensive or maybe insensitive is the word, because they have made an interesting decision with regard to their political ads just a day and a half after the biggest mass shooting in American history. The NRA has endorsed, because they endorse candidates. I almost said they endorse Republicans. It's basically Republicans that they endorse. The NRA has endorsed Republican Ed Gillespie for governor in Virginia, and they've also in Virginia endorsed Republican John D. Adams. So the NRA has this fund called the Political Victory Fund, which specifically runs ads to help candidates. And they were planning on running ads in favor of both Gillespie and Adams in Virginia. And according to Medium Buying is a company that they track ad spending. After the Las Vegas shooting took place, the buying agency decided to postpone the NRA political ads for 8 days, okay? Medium Buying on Twitter said that the NRA PVF TV ad spending that was scheduled to start tomorrow has been postponed, and the new start date is going to be October 10th. So these ads were specifically pro-gun about those two candidates, Gillespie and Adams. The ad was going to hail Gillespie as a, quote, leader in the growing national movement to expand our Second Amendment freedoms. If your message is only palatable or acceptable when there hasn't just been a mass shooting, then it's not a good message, right? The message from the gun safety advocates doesn't feel offensive or insensitive after a mass shooting. We need 100% background checks. We need limitations on what you can buy. We want gun insurance to be required for every gun owner, or licensing, whatever the case may be, right? The message from the gun safety advocates doesn't become offensive when there's just been a mass shooting. That tells us something about these messages that we hear from the NRA. And this is actually common for the NRA after there's a shooting. They will often go silent, kind of waiting out the grief. If you've never seen an NRA ad before, they are insane. I mean, they make it appear as though we are living in some kind of dystopian apocalypse. Here's a little bit of one, just to give you a sense.
They use their media to assassinate real news. They use their schools to teach children that their president is another Hitler. They use their movie stars and singers and comedy shows and award shows to repeat their narrative over and over again. And then they use their ex-president to endorse the resistance, all to make them march, make them protest, make them scream racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia, to smash windows, burn cars, shut down interstates and airports, bully and terrorize the law-abiding, until the only option left is for the police to do their jobs and stop the madness. And when that happens, they'll use it as an excuse for their outrage. The only way we stop this, the only way we save our country and our freedom, is to fight this violence of lies with the clenched fist of truth.
Yeah, doesn't exactly seem sensitive and empathetic after a mass shooting. Some of these ads are actually close to inciting violence, right? We're going to fight it with a clenched fist around a gun. And it's always the same routine. Right after the shooting, the right says it's too soon to talk about gun safety laws, and it's politicizing a tragedy. And then 10 days later, shooting, what shooting? They just go right back to the normal ads. And in this case, they're not even going to wait the 10 days. They're going to do it after 8 days. The reaction of cutting the ads, it's almost as if they recognize that they're running ads that actively encourage people to shoot others, and now they're waiting because someone actually shot others with not one but many of those guns. And I've mentioned this before. Gun sales are down under Trump because the NRA is no longer fear-mongering about the president of the United States coming for your guns like they did under Obama. A number, and we reported on this a month or two ago, a number of gun manufacturers have said, we've had to revise our estimates of gun sales downwards because we are just not seeing the interest in buying guns since President Trump has become president, because you are not getting the NRA saying the evil Democratic president is coming for your guns, so you'd better buy more. It's a really sick reality that we are dealing with here in the United States. That's the reaction from the NRA. Let's now go from the reaction to the Las Vegas mass shooting by Stephen Paddock from the NRA to that by Christian extremist, vile televangelist Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson hosts the 700 Club. It's been a while since we actually talked about Pat Robertson. So to catch you up, some of the things that Pat Robertson has said during his bizarre tenure as host of the 700 Club. He once said that men with rebellious wives should live where wife beating is legal because, well, do I really need to explain why? That secondhand clothes can come with demons attached, that abortion is a lesbian conspiracy, that atheists are trying to steal Christmas to make you miserable. Reminds me of a children's book, actually. That divorce is wrong unless your wife gets sick. And he has this great list of different items that over the years he said can or are demonic. And that includes feng shui, Ouija boards, yoga, karate, horoscopes, Twilight, paintings of Buddha, television shows about ghosts, Halloween, psychics, obviously, young girls who levitate their friends at sleepovers, and sometimes even adopted children from other countries can have demons attached, and that's a real problem. That's just a partial list. I don't have 2 hours to give you the full list of Pat Robertson's claims over the years. So back to yesterday. Pat Robertson is now blaming what is the worst mass shooting in American history, perpetrated by Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas late Sunday evening, which happened not even 48 hours ago, mind you, on the fact that he believes people are disrespecting Donald Trump and disrespecting the national anthem. I couldn't possibly explain it as well as Pat Robertson, so here he is explaining it to us.
Violence in the streets, ladies and gentlemen. Why is it happening? You know, what I'd like to give you is the fact that we have disrespect for authority. There is profound disrespect of our president all across this nation. They say terrible things about him. It's in the news, it's in other places. There's disrespect now for our national anthem, disrespect for our veterans, disrespect for the institutions of our government, disrespect for the court system, all the way up and down the line, disrespect. And when you lose that kind of respect, you lose this authority. But more than anything, until there is biblical authority, there has to be some controlling authority in our society, and there is none. And when there is no vision of God, the people say, there's no vision of God, the people run amok. When there's no vision of God, the people run amok.
So I want to focus on the second part of what he said, but just to give you the list again, the causes of the shooting in Las Vegas, according to Pat Robertson, were disrespect for authority, disrespect for the president, disrespect for the national anthem, for our veterans, for the institutions of our government, for the court system, up and down the line. And then he calls for Christian Sharia law, right? I mean, he says we need biblical authority. This is no different than someone calling for actual Islamic Sharia law. It's just a different flavor of it. What Pat Robertson is saying is that we need that authority from God to be our daily sort of ruling law. That's no different from the most extreme Muslim imams and religious figures. The difference is Pat Robertson says it while wearing a suit on ABC Family and the other channels that air his show during the 700 Club, instead of standing at the front of a mosque. That's the only difference. This is extremist clergy, period. It's what ISIS would say. Full stop. I mean, I don't have to qualify it any further. ISIS uses attacks like what we saw in Las Vegas to push their agenda. And Pat Robertson uses it to push a slightly different agenda, but one that is not altogether different in terms of its sort of fundamental qualities and requirements. Pat Robertson has accumulated a net worth of there's different estimates, between $200 million and $1 billion. This stuff pays. If I were a religious man, I would wonder, Doesn't Pat Robertson's existence, doesn't the fact that Pat Robertson became this wealthy off of religious nonsense of this caliber prove that there is no God? What type of God would allow Pat Robertson to become this rich from preaching hate and extremism? That's certainly something that we've talked about before. With regard to the Las Vegas shooting, of course, it's actually hugely disrespectful to the victims to say the problem is disrespect of Trump or the fact that we don't have a formal biblical authority in our country, because it makes it seem as if only we were more pious, if only we were more devoted to his pick of the religions, right? If we were only more devoted to Jesus, 59 or whatever the number is of people at this point, a growing number, horribly, wouldn't be dead right now, and 400 or 500 people wouldn't be injured. It's the height of insensitivity, and we should all be disgusted by what Pat Robertson is saying. Okay, so we've talked about the NRA's reaction to the Las Vegas mass shooting. We've talked about extremist cleric Pat Robertson's reaction to the Las Vegas shooting. What about a country musician? The Josh Abbott Band is a country music act, and not surprisingly, after the biggest mass shooting in American history in Las Vegas over the weekend, the band posted a message of thoughts for the victims on Twitter. Not at all surprising, but it went further. The guitarist for the Josh Abbott Band is Caleb Keeter, and he went further and he pointed out that the incident has fundamentally changed his mind about gun control. He posted to social media, "I've been a proponent of the Second Amendment my entire life, until the events of last night. I cannot express how wrong I was. We actually have members of our crew with concealed handgun licenses and legal firearms on the bus. They were useless. We couldn't touch them for fear police might think we were part of the massacre and shoot us. A small group or one man laid waste to a city with dedicated, fearless police officers desperately trying to help because of access to an insane amount of firepower. We need gun control right now. My biggest regret is that I stubbornly didn't realize it until my brothers on the road and myself were threatened by it. We are unbelievably fortunate to not be among the number of victims killed or seriously wounded by this maniac." First of all, I'm glad he spoke up, because if you're in the country music world, there is risk to taking a position like this. Country music fans don't take kindly often to anything other than standard right-wing, pro-gun apologia. Look at the blacklisting on endless radio stations of the Dixie Chicks when they spoke out during George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. They spoke out against that. Many in the country community, including endless country music stations, blacklisted them. Just one example. Now, as far as the logistics of what Caleb is saying here, he makes a point I've been making for years. In a general sense, it's easy to say, oh, good guys with guns stop the bad guys with guns. Think about the situations, though, because it's not that simple. There's a shooting going on and police show up and they see people with guns. You think they'll easily identify in the chaos who are the good people versus the bad people with the guns? And to go even further, how do multiple good guys with guns properly identify who is actually the shooter amidst the chaos without accidentally shooting each other? And a great example of this, it's a tragic example, is the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting, when we heard from so many gun advocates, if the movie theater hadn't been a gun-free zone, good guys with guns could have been armed. And when the Aurora shooter started shooting, the good guys with guns could have shot back. You're telling me that in a darkened movie theater where the sound of the shots being fired would be reverberating in an absolutely insane and headache-inducing way, that you'd be able to figure out what the direction of fire was, and of course, who the bad guy with the gun is if all of a sudden 10 people take out handguns? It's absolutely ridiculous. In this particular case in Vegas, by the way, the shooter was 32 floors up and 400 or 500 yards away. Anyone firing from the ground, how are you going to hit the suspect up on the 32nd floor without more likely risking hurting other civilians? So these are fantasies. So clearly on the specifics, I agree with Caleb Keeter. But my concern is that it took something personal happening to him for him to change his mind. Shouldn't we all be able to imagine what it might be like to be in that situation and come to the same conclusions that Caleb came to? I feel like I am, right? Like I came to the same conclusions as Caleb without being in the situation he was in. Why does it take some people's involvement personally in an incident like this to realize, hey, you know what? My view doesn't make sense. I need to rethink my views. That's really what bums me out, because it really shouldn't take being personally involved to say, hey, you know what? We need some of these common sense gun safety rules and laws. Even if it wouldn't have prevented this particular incident, what argument remains against 100% totally universal background checks, for example? Something that even after Sandy Hook, with 80 or 85% support, our legislators failed to pass. That's the part that bums me out, but I'm still glad that Caleb Keeter came to these conclusions. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Quick break, back with 20 more.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day, I am very proud to tell you, is Robert Knight. Robert, thanks so much for being a David Pakman Show member. We do depend on the support of folks like Robert and everybody else who supports us. This program doesn't get produced by itself. We actually have infrastructure here. That infrastructure costs money, which is why we go to the audience for support. davidpakman.com/membership. You can sign up. We've got a coupon code available. That coupon code is IVoted17, all one word, all lowercase. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 per month on Patreon at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And remember that if you ever do shop on Amazon.com, merely going to davidpakman.com/Amazon before you shop will make it so that every purchase of yours will send us a little kickback. Okay, some documents have been turned over to federal investigators, and they reveal two previously undisclosed contacts between Donald Trump's organization and Russia during the 2016 campaign. Donald Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, who for months denied any and all involvement, period, with anything Russia-related, which was ultimately proven to be a lie, exchanged emails with a business associate weeks before the Republican National Convention about the lawyer possibly traveling to an economic conference in Russia that would be attended by top Russian financial and government leaders, including none other than President Vladimir Putin, according to people familiar with the correspondence. There was a second incident that we now know involved the same lawyer, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen received a proposal in 2015 for a real estate project in Moscow from a company founded by a billionaire who once served in the upper house of the Russian parliament. So we now know of not one, but of two specific real estate proposals for Trump-branded Moscow buildings that were discussed during the 2016 campaign, and both involved Donald Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen. If you've ever seen this guy interviewed, you would already be aware of how slimy the guy is. But the issue for me isn't whether these real estate deals were done. I mean, they weren't. We have no indication that they ultimately were. It's that this type of contact has been denied time and time again by everyone associated with Trump. Between July of 2016 and February of 2017 alone, that's just an 8-month period, there were almost 24 prominent denials of any contact with Russia by Trump associates. And the most interesting part, every time I say it, there's someone in our audience who gets mad. You probably have your finger hovering over the dislike button right now if you're watching on YouTube, and by all means, press the button if it makes you feel good. This is sounding a lot like what Christopher Steele said was happening in that Russia blackmail dossier. The blackmail dossier says that in June of 2016, Michael Cohen was involved in emails involving Felix Sater, the Russian-born real estate developer and former Trump business associate, about buildings and Trump Tower Moscow and all of this stuff. I won't read it all to you again, but it's more and more confirmation of what Christopher Steele had in that dossier. And if you're waiting around for the Trumpists to sort of come to terms with what has happened, I advise you not to hold your breath, because they would sooner sing the Russian national anthem while standing, not while on bended knee, than admit that the Donald Trump campaign did some really sketchy stuff involving Russia. And I don't know why, because I kind of generally lack confidence in justice being carried out and the real truth being found, I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller is eventually going to figure all of this stuff out. I'm normally such a cynic and a skeptic, and sort of the opposite of naively thinking it's all going to be worked out the way the law dictates. But for some reason, I am holding out hope that Robert Mueller is actually going to get to the bottom of this. And it is national tragedy after bungled disaster combined with terrible leadership and corrupt lies day after day. We want to believe, and maybe this is what I'm experiencing, I want to believe that someday we will actually figure out what happened. It will sort of get straightened out, and then, I don't know, we'll get back on the horse, so to speak. Maybe I am naive, and if I am, I don't know, send me emails, ideally not too angry. So we already knew last week about these private email accounts that were used individually by Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law, and Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter, both of whom have roles in the White House. Last week, we learned that son-in-law Jared Kushner had been using private email actually since December of 2016, specifically for White House-related work. We also learned last week, the day after, that Ivanka Trump, Donald Trump's daughter and sort of high-powered advisor, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment, she also has been using personal email accounts for government work. Now, there's been a huge effort to try to downplay it all, including with Jared Kushner. There's a statement we read last week, which I'll read for you again today, from Jared Kushner's attorney, where Abe Lowell said Mr. Kushner uses his White House email address to conduct White House business. Fewer than 100 emails from January through August were either sent to or returned by Mr. Kushner to colleagues in the White House from his personal email account. These usually forwarded news articles or political commentary, and most often occurred when someone initiating the exchange by sending an email to his personal rather than his White House address. Now, let's keep that up just for a second, because there's a couple words I want to point out, which are weasel words, right? These usually forwarded news articles, and you also have to look at the word most often occurred. Those make the statement effectively meaningless in communicating what Kushner's lawyer wants to communicate. So that's what we knew up until yesterday. Now we've learned of a third previously unreported personal email account for Jared and Ivanka Trump. They had their own private email domain, a family domain. Hundreds of emails were sent to it since January from White House email addresses, and the documents sent include non-public travel documents, I'll get back to that in a second, internal schedules, official White House materials, and again, these were largely from White House accounts, sometimes from other private accounts. And by the way, not only did Jared and Ivanka both have access to this account, so did the staff of their house. Why is that relevant? Non-public travel schedules, their household staff. Republicans used to regularly, happily remind everybody that when it came to Hillary's emails, there were non-public travel documents, which are considered classified, that were being sent around. Now we have Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's staff reading non-public schedules on their private email account. But I guess it's only bad when Hillary does it, right? How does Jared Kushner still have a job, or at least a security clearance? Because this proves to us that it was never actually about Hillary Clinton's emails. It was a smear campaign, period. And parts of this are actually worse than what Hillary Clinton did. For example, Hillary Clinton didn't send classified information to her private email address specifically to share it with her staff, who might not have had security clearances. That's what's happening with this email belonging to Jared and Ivanka Trump. They shared access to that email address with the staff of their home, and documents that are not supposed to be public were readily accessible by the staff of their house. This is not a big deal because of the act itself. It's a big deal because Republicans were so successfully able to turn this into something that was very damaging to Hillary Clinton, and they all do it. Where is Congressman Jason Chaffetz calling for an investigation or leading an investigation? Wait a second. Chaffetz did this himself. One of many Republicans who did it. Vice President Mike Pence had an AOL account. Chris Kobach used one while he was on Donald Trump's voter suppression commission. It is a very, very long list. There should be a German word for this level of hypocrisy. We know the word Schadenfreude, which is pleasure derived by someone for another's misfortune. The word hypocrisy or double standard is not a strong enough word here. I'm not good at German. I don't speak German, but maybe there is a German word for this level of hypocrisy and double standards. The exact thing that according to them, disqualified Hillary Clinton from being president of the United States is something they all were doing and continue to do even to this day. Discuss this with us on our Reddit discussion forum, davidpakman.com/REDVIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Dr. Sandro Galea, who's a physician, epidemiologist, and dean of the Boston University School of Public Health. His new book is called Healthier: 50 Thoughts on the Foundations of Population Health. It was published in June. It's so great to speak to you. You know, every time there's a natural disaster, we hear a lot about immediate disaster relief. We sometimes hear a little bit about climate change, but we don't necessarily hear as much about the broader public health implications that there sometimes are. So talk to us a little bit about your work and sort of how all of these different pieces fit together.
Yeah, the challenge, I think, is very much is that we have a very reactive approach to disasters in this country and in the world, really, that an event happens and we have this outpouring of attention and empathy, which I think is all terrific. The problem is that we have been terrible at thinking about disasters as part of a long-term continuum. And I think the challenge is that we tend to say, well, we don't know when disasters are going to happen or where they're going to happen. So as a result, we'll just wait until one happens. But the truth is that we do know that disasters happen. We do know that they're going to happen. We actually have a fairly good sense of where many of them will be happening. And what we should be doing is focusing on being prepared for events. Not just that, we should also make sure that we are ready for the medium and long term after these events. Because the truth is, after injuries and after the acute post-disaster phase of danger passes, that is when you start seeing the other conditions set in that result in the long-term consequences, particularly health consequences of these events, which are mostly in the mental health realm. And unless we are both prepared for events to happen and then when they happen, settling in for a long haul effort, we are substantially shortchanging the people who are affected by these events.
It sort of seems like the inherent nature of our socio-political system does not really help to think about these issues in the way you're suggesting. I mean, one example would be hurricanes are acute events. We know a few days beforehand that they're going to happen. They have a certain start, beginning, middle, and end, and then we enter what's called the recovery phase. Compare that to, for example, heat, excessive heat, which is probably in 2017 going to kill more people than the hurricanes did, but it's an ongoing issue. It doesn't have a particular beginning, middle, and end. We have elections. Members of Congress are reelected every 2 years. The way the budget process is done is once a year. It seems like the sort of underpinnings of our political system and how we even prepare for these types of issues lends itself to the acute hurricane versus the longer term issues. Is that, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I think it's a combination of our political system, as you say, and our collective cultural attention span. And we focus very much on short-term results and on short-term wins to the detriment of longer-term ideas and longer-term solutions. Let me be concrete. Let's be concrete. We know that the groups that are going to be most affected, most hurt by disasters are those who are marginalized, socially isolated. And we know that that's consistent across events. And one can, with extraordinary predictability, say this is going to happen wherever an event happens. We also know which are the parts of the country that are more likely to be affected by hurricanes. So you would think that we could take a bit of a long-term view and say, how do we deal with these populations so that we don't have these hundreds of thousands of people who are deeply vulnerable to an event? But we do not do that. We wait until an event happens. Then, of course, we see acts of heroism. We see injection of large amounts of congressional monies. But people, unfortunately, have already suffered. And that suffering was entirely predictable and preventable.
When we think about some of these disasters and sort of what we mean by prevention, where in this is the conversation about whether certain parts of the United States, or certainly the world is also, there are other parts of the world that also have this question, should be sort of depopulated, or whether they should be re-inhabited after a disaster? I mean, we sort of know, based on what science tells us, about the parts of the United States and the world that are going to be increasingly at risk due to extreme weather events or the rising sea level. At what point do we have a conversation about whether some of these areas should even be inhabited at all?
It's a really sensitive conversation, right? It's a sensitive conversation to say, should people who have made a home in this part of the country rebuild? Should this be an area where we have human habitation? I think it's a tough conversation, and it's certainly a conversation that cannot and should not be had in the immediate aftermath of an event. It's a difficult conversation that needs to take into account social connections, needs to account the amount of disruption to people's lives and social networks that would be occasioned if we chose not to build in particular areas. And the time to have that conversation is not when everybody is under duress because of an event. The time to have the conversation is now, when there is no such duress. So I think it's emblematic of the need for a larger conversation about disasters, their potential consequences, and having that conversation not when the winds are howling, not after the winds are howling, but at a time when things are calm, when we can actually have a rational discussion about the scope of potential damage when there is no immediate threat.
Yeah, I do understand that. At the same time, I mean, to take the issue of gun safety as an example, sometimes you can really only have a conversation after there's been an incident. And, you know, we saw President Obama criticized for talking about universal background checks after the Sandy Hook shooting. And many critics were saying, you know, you're politicizing this because you're talking about it after there was an event. If you talk about it when things are calm, don't many people understate the importance of having the discussion? I mean, I think it's tough either way, but I think there's another side to that.
No, I see the point, and I think if there ever was a time when really when we should be having this discussion, it's now. After seeing Harvey, Irma, Maria, probably the last biggest time when such a discussion was really right in front of our face was after Katrina, about 10 years ago. So that's fine. That's fine. I think if these events can serve as a stimulus for the conversation, that's a good thing. That we should have the conversation. But what should happen then is we should have the conversation and keep having the conversation rather than stopping and letting all this fade from public view, so that a month from now nobody even remembers what the hurricanes were. So if what it takes for the public conversation is events to nudge us forward, then so be it. But we know we're not going to resolve this conversation in a week or in 2 weeks or even in a month, but that conversation needs to then stay high on public agenda.
I'd like to touch on some sort of ancillary or related issues when we talk about natural disasters and public health. There's been a debate over the sort of carrying capacity in terms of the population of our planet. And there's sort of two sides on this. One side is that based on our current energy consumption, we're getting very, very close to what we would maybe colloquially refer to as overpopulation on the planet. The other side is, you know, the truth is people are concentrated mostly around urban areas, and that a lot of the planet is still wide open, and there's more than enough space for many, many times larger a population than we currently have. What's the right approach when we want to consider the impact of the world population on public health in terms of thinking about that population question?
I think the right approach is recognizing that the reason we have had a more human impact of disasters in the past 20, 30 years, and we know we have from databases that look at disasters, are really two factors. Number one is global environmental climate change that has resulted in more natural events, mostly hydrological events. And secondly is the growth in cities, and the growth in cities worldwide that are largely in areas that are near water and are affected quite a bit by this global environmental climate change. So those two factors result in more human impact of disasters over the past several decades. Now, how does one approach that? I think the approach to it is to say, urbanization, by and large, is a very positive force. And we are going to keep urbanizing. We know that health indicators in urban areas are by and large better than non-urban areas. So the question is not how to stop urbanization. The question is, how do we build healthier cities? How do we build cities that are safer, more resilient, more resistant to the events of disasters? On the other angle, which is global environmental climate change, this is one of several of the downstream consequences of global environmental climate change. And this should serve as a collective global clarion call to the fact that we need to tackle that. So I tend to think that arguments about population size are really distractions. We know we have capacity to do a lot better than we're doing given how we're currently living. And I think we can turn what in the context of disasters has been a disadvantage into an advantage if we create cities that are built healthy, that promote health, and if we mitigate human-made climate change that is putting these cities more at risk.
Well, the urbanization topic is really, really interesting to me. Of course, you're in Boston. Our studio is also in Boston. And Boston is very interesting because it is a very healthy metropolitan area overall. But within Boston, there are significant inequalities in both access to care as well as even life expectancy. I mean, there are drastic differences in health outcomes on a number of different indicators in neighborhoods that are just a couple of miles away within the city of Boston. So can you talk a little bit about, in the context of urbanization and dealing with climate change, how inequality should be considered and how we can deal with that in a public health setting?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And I've written about inequalities in Boston as well as in other places. The truth of the matter is that when disasters happen, they do not hit urban inhabitants evenly. They hit them disproportionately, with a disproportionate burden on the vulnerable, the marginalized, socioeconomically disadvantaged groups. That is true in Boston as it is anywhere else. A city like Boston is a good example. Boston is a wealthy city, and it's a city which, for example, has the highest physician population ratio of anywhere else in the country. And yet, in a place like Boston, you have fivefold differences in the prevalences of some disorders, just 2 to 3 miles apart. And that has nothing to do with access to medicine, nothing to do with access to doctors. It has everything to do with underlying social, economic, cultural conditions that ultimately create health. And when disasters happen, it is the vulnerable socioeconomic disadvantaged groups who cannot evacuate, who do not have the resources to buffer them from the losses incurred by disasters. And it is that group, inevitably, that ends up being hit the most, both in terms of physical health, mental health, as well as the long-term consequences of disasters. We did a study where we looked at this, for example, after Hurricane Sandy in New York City, showed exactly that the groups who had resources mostly got out of the way, mostly were able to ride out the storm, mostly were able to rebuild fairly quickly. And then you have the group that is marginalized who gets affected. And I think one of the challenges we have is when we think of socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, we tend to think of, well, that's a small group. But it's not a small group. We're actually talking about half the country, And there's ample data that shows that we have had a separation between the wealthier half and the poorer half of the country. Half the country is 50% of people. And that group is incurring the much heavier burden of the health consequences of how we're evolving as society than they used to incur 30, 40, 50 years ago.
We've been speaking to Dr. Sandro Galea. His new book is Healthier, 50 Thoughts on the Foundations of Population Health. I really appreciate you joining me, and these are all issues that are certainly not going away anytime soon, so we would love to have you back.
I'd be glad to come back anytime. Thank you for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit because we are talking more and more about Donald Trump's tax proposal, which we analyzed in detail last week. Republicans are responsible for creating some very stick-to-the-wall myths about tax cuts, myths that have really stuck around and are often repeated. For example, they like to say that high taxes and high tax rates created stagflation in the 1970s. So stagflation is high inflation plus high unemployment with sort of stagnant demand in a country's economy. They like to say that Reagan cutting taxes back in 1981, for example, launched this amazing period of economic growth. That is a lot of what the supply side defenders base their defense of cutting taxes for the rich on. And when you look into the details, it falls apart in an instant. The truth is that there was a huge interest rate reduction by the Federal Reserve that coincided with Ronald Reagan's actions in the early 80s. When you cut the federal funds rate, that stimulates the economy in the short run. Now, there's debates to be had, and we've had them, and all sorts of economists from Robert Reich to Paul Krugman and right-wing economists have weighed in on the impact of low federal funds interest rates over the long term. But in the short term, you have huge economic upticks as a result of lowering of the federal funds rate. In addition, at the same time that Reagan was doing this, there was major infrastructure spending. This included highway construction. That, combined with the end of the recession that had been taking place, is actually what's responsible for the optimistic, positive economic indicators that coincided but were not caused by Ronald Reagan's adjustments to taxes. Another canard from the low tax right is if you cut taxes for the rich, it's good for the economy. I guess because either the rich will spend their money or they'll hire people in their businesses or for some other reasons. But that's a common one from the right. The reality is that's just not true. And I've explained this concept before. It's the economic concept of the marginal propensity to consume. If you're really rich and your taxes are lowered and now you have a little more money, you never needed that money for your day-to-day life unless you're incredibly bad with money. So you're not that likely to reinsert that money into the economy. You're probably going to save a lot of that money. If you give a tax cut to people who earn a lot less, where they would use that tax cut to fund their day-to-day life, that is way more economically stimulative. So that argument doesn't make any sense. Then you go to corporations. The right likes to say, American corporations are just too highly taxed. Let's cut taxes for corporations and it'll stimulate the economy. That makes absolutely no sense. Capital investment by business owners is already tax deductible. When you think about what that means, if you are a business owner and the tax rate is really high, you can avoid a high tax rate by investing money in your business because it lowers your taxable income. In fact, that suggests that higher corporate tax rates actually would incentivize businesses to reinvest capital by buying stuff or improving or hiring or whatever. But it actually doesn't make sense either. And I've been clear about why, because Donald Trump's tax proposal, for me, it would be good, right? I have a business that is a corporation, an S corporation, meaning that there is pass-through income. Donald Trump's tax proposal would create a new 25% tax rate for pass-through income. That's the situation I'm in with the show. But that doesn't mean that it's good economics. If my taxes go down for the income that passes through to me on the program, then I am more incentivized not to invest that money into the show. Think about it. If you lower the rate I can keep the show's money at, I am more likely to keep the show's money. I think if I wanted to do an expansion of the show or new programming or get better equipment or whatever, the money I spend will reduce the taxes to zero on that expenditure. I'm more likely to do that if taxes are higher. And I'm not suggesting that I actually make decisions based on tax rates. Very few businesses actually do. But this concept that if you lower the tax rate on businesses, all of a sudden they're going to reinvest a ton of that money into the economy is just not true. Now, depending on my personal financial situation or someone else's, I might spend that extra money that I get to keep. I might save that extra money that I get to keep, but that's a decision made at the personal level. And the stimulus that these folks claim will happen from lowering the corporate tax rate just will not happen. The entire supply side tax cut right-wing thing is merely a ruse, and it's a ruse that Trump and his friends will be able to save a lot of money with. The amount of money that Trump and his buddies will be able to keep if this tax plan goes through is absolutely stunning. And we'll actually have a report on that coming up as to how much Trump's cabinet would save if this tax plan actually happened. Let's talk not about taxes, but about the minimum wage. Target is sort of the slightly less offensive than Walmart mega retailer. Their minimum wage has been $10 an hour for quite some time, and Walmart has also since raised their minimum wage to $10. So now Target has announced they're going to raise their minimum wage to $11 starting this month, and they will ultimately roll it out to all employees. And they're also committing to a $15 minimum wage by 2020. So key question, how many people at Target will get a raise as a result of the minimum wage there going from $10 to $11? In other words, how many people at Target are already making $11 and how many are making under $11? Answer is Target isn't telling us. There's a lot of Target employees who have said this is really good optics for Target, but the truth is that most people there are not getting any raises as a result of performance or longevity. They're just getting these yearly or semi-yearly raises to everyone's minimum wage at Target. And that's actually controversial. There are people who say, listen, if new employees make the same amount or almost the same amount as people who have been working at Target for a while, that's really not good for morale. If you've been there 5 years and someone gets hired and you have a 20-cent an hour difference in wage with them, you're going to feel devalued. On the other hand, from Target's perspective, how do you justify paying some people drastically more than others when 2 to 3 months of training is basically all you need to know everything there is to know and be operating at basically full potential? Very interesting debate that often comes up when we talk about the minimum wage. Now back to the Walmart thing. When I have to go to these types of stores, and it's not that often, I will go to a Target. I have not been to a Walmart in probably more than 10 years at this point. And part of it is, and it sounds kind of crazy, Target seems to be slightly less bad than Walmart. And I don't actually know if that's true, right? I mean, the instinct is, and from the PR coverage that we've seen, that Target is slightly less bad than Walmart. But I genuinely don't know if that's actually the case or if it's just sort of an idea that I've created for myself. Automation is likely to grow at Target. They're already employing self-checkout machines, which are ultimately going to replace cashiers. Target has made a big deal for a while of saying in the short term, we are not firing cashiers or replacing cashiers with automated checkouts. But I think we all sort of see where it's going. So this is my question to you right in. Do you see Target as being not as bad as Walmart? Or is it basically Walmart with better PR, better lighting in their stores, and sort of a more minimalist merchandising and design? I go very infrequently, but I believe for some reason that I'm doing something not quite as bad by going to Target than Walmart. I might be living in a total fantasy world, so let me know. Got a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Caller raises an interesting question. Yesterday, we talked about the Congressman Michael Grimm, former congressman who was sent to prison, is now out of prison, and he wants to go back to being a congressman. And here's a voicemail sort of related to that.
Hey, David, was just listening to your show. You were talking about this guy who just got out of prison for tax evasion. And I was just thinking how it's interesting how people who've gone to prison can go back into office, but at the same time, the president can't vote. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on that. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, I've actually talked about this before. The entire convicted felons can't vote thing. If we believe as a society that you commit a crime, and in order to repay that debt to society, you go to prison. Once you get out of prison, presumably your debt has been paid, and you should be fully reinstated as a member of society, which includes voting rights. I think that there is a case to be made, and by the way, this is not uncontroversial. There's an easier case to make that while you are in prison, you should not be allowed to vote. I'm not saying I'm taking that position, but that case is stronger to me. Once you've paid your debt to society, I don't understand the rationale for saying you still cannot vote, because once you're released, it's because you've, on paper, made good for the crime that you committed. So I think that's interesting. It is easier to get back into politics after being in prison or jail than it is to vote. And that's probably something that relates to our priorities that we have to rethink. On today's bonus show, Tom Petty, dead at 66 years old. We will talk about that. We will talk about the Nobel Prize winning Americans who have done some interesting research on circadian rhythms, very interesting. And we will also delve a little bit into the background that's been uncovered of Las Vegas shooter Stephen Paddock, gambling, someone who was a pilot, just very unusual and sort of sporadic bits of his history, but still nothing approximating what we would sort of colloquially think of as a motive for what is now known as, and was, the deadliest mass shooting in American history. So you can get access to the bonus show and hear us talk about all of those stories by signing up at davidpakman.com/membership. There's a coupon code available. It's iVoted17. You can also get access to the bonus show and the commercial-free broadcast show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow, where contributions start at just $1 a month. Check it out, pick your poison, and then we will talk to you on the bonus show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.